Alright, let's look at our next example. Write a loop that finds the index of the first negative number in a vector and stores it in answer. If there are no negative numbers, it should set answer to value of -1, which is not a legal index, so it's a good way to indicate this special case. So we'll write a script where we'll have a precondition of some vector, and then the postcondition will be the index of the first negative number in that vector, and if there's no negative numbers, we'll return a value of 1, or -1. Okay, so let's go to MATLAB and give it a try. Okay, here we are in MATLAB, and first things is, you'll notice I haven't cleaned up since the last example problem. So let me start by closing both of those, clearing my screen, and you'll notice I don't need to clear my workspace because there's no variables that exist in my workspace. Okay, so let's create a new script. Okay, and so the script will return the index of the first negative element of vector x. If no negative element exists, returns a value of -1. Okay. Guess you could just as well do 0 as well, that 0 being false, but we'll follow the problem statement and use -1. Regardless, -1 or 0, it's not a valid index number, so the user can't do anything with it, and so there they'll quickly see that error message. Okay, excellent. So we'll have a precondition. The precondition will be x vector we want the index for. The postcondition, we're told to store the result to answer, MATLAB's default variable. So answer, so index of first negative element. Okay, and so the way I'm going to set this up is we're told that if a negative element doesn't exist, to assign to answer a value of -1. So let's start by assigning a value of -1 to answer. Okay, so essentially we'll assume that a negative value doesn't exist, and then we'll search to see if a negative value does exist, and if it does, we'll just update the value of answer. Okay, so we'll start by assuming a negative value does not exist. Okay, and so now let's conduct our search. So I'm searching for the first negative element in the vector. Okay, so if I'm going to want to check each and every element of that vector to see if it's negative, that's screaming to me, let's perform a for loop. Let's loop over each element one at a time. And since I'm looking for the first occurrence, I'll start my loop with I equals 1, which will correspond to the first element of that vector. So let me loop for I is equal to 1, and then I'm going to loop all the way up to the last element of the vector, which would be length of x. Okay. Before I forget, let me save this, and let's call this, I don't know, negative index. Okay, so loop for I equals 1 to length x. And then what do we want to do each loop iteration? Well, I'd like to check to see if that ith element of vector x is negative. If it is, I found my answer, I want that index, and we can exit since I only want the first one. Okay, so if I want to check to see if I have a negative value, let's do if x of I, the ith element of x, is negative, would correspond to if the ith element is less than 0. Okay, and notice MATLAB is automatically keeping track of the indentation and formatting for me, which is great, okay, especially when I have compound statements like this. So if x of I is less than 0, success. Okay, and what do I want to do if I find a negative value? Well, I want to store to variable a and s the corresponding index, which would be I, and then I can stop my search, and so I can exit my for loop with the break command. Okay, I can end that if, and I can end my for. Again, noticing the MATLAB nicely lines everything up. All right, and when I click on the end, right, I can see the statement that it's ending. Okay, so what do we have going on? So we start by assigning to answer a value of -1. Then we loop over our vector and check to see if each element starting with the first is negative. If it is, we store that index to a and s and then exit. Okay. As you'll scroll over here, you'll see I get a little note, MATLAB doesn't recommend using a and s. Again, the reason for that is every time I perform a calculation, if I'm not performing an assignment to variable, that's the default variable that MATLAB will use. So you just need to be careful to make sure you're not overwriting anything. Okay, and so let's add a couple more comments. So here we're looping over vector, starting with the first element, and then we're checking to see if the element is negative. Okay, great. And so the break will kick us out. So let's save it. Okay, and let's start by creating some vector. So let's do x is equal to, let's see, what do we want to do? Let's do 10 to 5 in increments of -1. Okay. Oh, sorry. We were working for the first negative to -1 in increments of -1. Okay, so 10, 9, 8, 7, and so on and so forth up to -1. Okay. So which is the first negative element of x? Well, it's this last one. All right. So it'd be length of x, the 12th element. All right, and just to check, if I were to point to that last element, length of x, I get -1. I also note, jumping ahead of myself, another key way that I can point to that last index is just using end. Okay, cool. So let's see if with this value of x, if I run my script, if I'll correctly get a value assigned to answer of 12, and just to confirm, let's print that value at the end. Okay, so let's run it. So this is negative index. So running, we get 12, success. Okay, if we want to do another example, let's try linspace. And then, so linspace should be able to operate going backwards too. Let's do 5 to -1. And by default that will go in increments of 100, or will be 100 equally spaced points. Negative index, first negative index is element 84, and so just to check, if we were to look at the 83rd, hey, it's positive. If we look at the 84th, all right, it's negative. Good, success. All right, so so that guy works. With that, you can turn me off if you want, or in the interest of spoiling all of the fun and getting a little bit ahead of myself, I want to look at just one more trick in terms of how we can simplify this code. Okay, but again, if you're not interested, by all means, you can tune me out. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, and I'm going to save a copy, and let's call it, say, spoil. All right, we're going to spoil all the fun. Okay, so if you recall, if I had x, okay, so my integers or my indices are going to go from 1 to however many number of elements I have in my vector in increments of 1. Okay, so if I were to try and point to the -1 element of x, right, I get an error message. And in that error message, it says that the index must be a positive integer or a logical value. Okay, and so what we'll play with next is we can use logical checks to find that first negative value. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our first definition of x, which is a little shorter. this one. Right? This only had 12 elements. In this case, it was element 12. That was the first negative element. Okay. If I were to do a logical, if I were to apply a logical operator to a vector, the result will be a logical vector. So if I do x less than 0, okay, the result's a logical vector where what MATLAB will do is it'll look element-wise at my vector. So it'll look at each element and check to see if each element is less than 0. If it is, you get a value of 0, which is false. Otherwise, 1 corresponds to true. So what it does, or what it did here, is it checked each element and evaluated whether or not each element was less than 0 and stored all of that result all in a vector. Okay, follow me so far? And so if I wanted to just pull off the 12th element, or all elements that were negative, I could do, say, is a compound statement x less than 0. So x less than 0 will produce a logical vector, and then I can use that to just point to the elements of x for which that is true. Okay, and so what I get is just -1. So I get that negative value. If I wanted to find the index, there's a couple of tricks to find the index. One would be the find command, or checking for equivalencies once again. But we will, well, okay, so if I were to do find x less than 0, right, I get 12, right, I get the index. Okay, so there's lots of different ways to do it, but remember, MATLAB specializes in vector and matrix operations, so just know that there are other simpler ways to do it, and we'll get to those in due time in the course. Here we're just starting with some basics.